This video is brought to you by Straight Goods News, Canada's alternative online news source. Visit straightgoods.ca.
We saw it when Jim Flaherty unilaterally announced the new healthcare formula without consulting the provinces about what the needs of our healthcare system will be. For the Conservatives, healthcare is only about dollars and cents, not health outcomes, so why bother discussing how to ensure Canadians get the best healthcare possible? And I think this goes to a fundamental difference that has lasted for decades between the approach to federalism of the Harper government versus the approach of previous Liberal and progressive Conservative governments. Essentially, Stephen Harper sees federalism as operating in watertight compartments. Either it's federal or it's provincial, and never the twain shall meet. So if that's the case, if everything is separate and watertight, why bother meeting each other? And I think that is the approach he has been implementing over the years in power. And for me and for the Liberal Party, this is a totally wrong-headed approach. The world is complex, jurisdictions overlap, there's a need for federal government to be at the table, for federal leadership to ensure greater equality and equality of opportunity across the country. And the subject that I'm discussing today, which is affordable housing, is a prime example of this federal neglect of important areas. I think if you remember a document related to fiscal imbalance back in 2006, the Harper government, the then new Harper government, singled out 3 specific areas which they said should be exclusively provincial. Those were affordable housing, homelessness, and childcare. And so what I want to discuss today is the example of affordable housing. We have an affordable housing framework which is set to expire in just 20 months. We see no sign that that will be replaced. We have CMHC agreements that expire after 30 years, which are in the process of expiring, with no sign of any action being taken by the government to help homeowners provide needed renovations to their homes. When this program's predecessor was created in 2001, the federal government provided hundreds of millions of dollars to help build new rental units across the country. There are 2 segments of the population that rely heavily on rental housing: recent immigrants who are saving to buy their first home, and young Canadians, particularly post-secondary students, who have not yet set down roots in a community. For students who don't have the option of living at home with their parents, housing is one of the largest costs that they will have to pay throughout their studies. And access to affordable rental housing is therefore a key ingredient to graduating with as little student debt as possible. But rental housing is becoming very hard to find in many Canadian cities. The vacancy rate in many of Canada's cities with universities and colleges has remained persistently low for many years now. In some cities, there's virtually no available rental housing. Regina and Quebec City have vacancy rates of 0.7%. In Toronto, it's slightly better at 1.5%. But as we saw in a Royal Bank report from yesterday, in 2004, that vacancy rate was 4%. Today, it's 1.5%. The CMHC considers a 3% vacancy rate healthy for our cities. When vacancy rates fall that low, not only does it mean people will have a difficult time finding a place to live, but we start to see severe upward pressure on monthly
There's also
rents.
been a trend to convert purpose-built rental units into condominium buildings. Hamilton, for instance, has seen roughly 800 apartment conversions in recent years. While home ownership, be it standalone or condominium, is a wonderful goal, it is not available to all Canadians at any given time. We have to remember that 1/3 of Canadians are renters. This creates an obvious problem when rental units only account for roughly 10% of new builds, as has been the case in the last few years. To combat this, the Liberal Party has been echoing the FCM's call for the federal government to implement some very simple tax measures that would give investors incentive to undertake new purpose-built rental units. First, the government could provide low-interest loans to developers who build rental units. Also, the government could create tax incentives to help maintain existing rental housing. For instance, an eco-energy
housing tax credit, as called for by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, would help landlords improve the quality of their rental stock while reducing utility costs for tenants. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions.
Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un qui veut poser des questions? Any questions? Steve Reining?
Yeah, this is a little more regional, but just I want to get your thoughts on the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation had a report out this morning saying the average Ontario home prices have risen 17% in the last 4 years. Just wondering if I could get some thoughts on that.
You mean in terms of whether we might have a bubble approaching us? Certainly, a house price going up by 17% over the last 4 years, the average, is a high rate in the environment we find ourselves in. And if you look at international comparisons of house price to income ratios, Canada's among the higher levels around the world. And we are approaching now levels of house prices relative to income similar to what existed in the U.S. prior to their bubble. So certainly there are many economists out there saying that particularly for condos in Toronto, we may have an impending bubble and a housing price correction. It's worth noting that my previous employer, the Royal Bank, came up with a report yesterday downplaying the likelihood of such a bubble burst for various reasons, although even they forecast a correction of 3 to 7%, whereas other economists and groups would forecast larger corrections than that. So I'm not offering you a forecast. I'm not in that business anymore. But I am saying that if you look at the evidence, the statistical evidence, and if you look at the opinions of various economists, we are certainly at risk of some correction in the housing market, and the recovery is already fragile, and certainly a significant housing correction would make matters a lot worse.
Last week we spoke to Ralph Goodale, and he mentioned that the relationship with China was a little bit too little too late, and that the Conservatives had avoided contact with China for many ideological reasons. Would you want to elaborate upon that and maybe speak a little bit about China in English?
Yeah. That is absolutely right. As I said, I think in French, Liberals have been in favor of expanding trade and investment and cultural relations with China for decades, and we've always been on that path, starting with Pierre Trudeau for early recognition, moving on to Jean Chrétien and his China trips, and subsequent Liberal leaders as well. Now, with Stephen Harper, it's been very much an up-and-down ride. When he first came to power in 2006, he had many, many China haters in his caucus, and I think he was one of them. And they avoided no opportunity to poke a stick in China's eye, whether it was boycotting the Beijing Olympics, keeping the Chinese foreign minister waiting for 6 months before he got to meet the foreign minister, and many, many other instances of strong anti-China behavior. Now, all of a sudden, he's changed his tune. John Baird was even stronger than Jean Chrétien would have been when he referred to China as an ally. Now, China is a friend. I don't think China is an ally. So they've done a huge flip-flop, and they flip-flopped to something approaching our position. And so in that sense, we're pleased. But the fact that for 3 years they insulted China, and now they suddenly flip-flop, the Chinese have long memories. There's the story of Henry Kissinger asking Zhou Enlai what would be the implications of the French Revolution, and Zhou Enlai said it was too early to tell. So that's hundreds of years. I don't think the Chinese forget the Harper behavior in the first 3 years of his government. In fact, they publicly chastised him at a meeting in China when he first went over, or when he went over there, saying he had taken too long to come to China. So I think Canada is paying a price. I think they're back on what seems to be a good Liberal track right now, but I think Canadians will continue to pay a price for those 3 years of China insulting, because I don't think the Chinese forget that quickly.